Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you're listening to a weekly podcast about books and life, not necessarily in that order. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at facebook.com/virtualmemoriesshow, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and tunein.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to the iTunes store, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and a review for us. Maybe that'll inspire Apple to promote us a little. And of course, you can also promote us by telling people about the podcast on social media or however else you publicize the things you like. You can support the Virtual Memories Show and get access to exclusive content with a recurring monthly donation via Patreon. Just visit patreon.com/vmspod and set up your level of support. You'll get new material from our patron-only blog, and you'll also get to listen to my quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, which features extra material from our guests and is only available to supporters of the show. So visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. Now, I've met a couple of kindred spirits through this podcast. I could name some of them, but the ones I don't name would get mad on the off chance they're listening. But I have to say, the kindredist might be this week's guest, Michael Gerber. Michael's the editor of The American Bystander, a print-only humor/satire magazine whose contributor list is, like my podcast roster, only a million times better. The Bystander began in 2016, and it's been coming out regularly, driven primarily by crowdfunding and subscription. You can subscribe really easily at patreon.com/bystander. Now, I got turned on to The Bystander by one of my past guests and a regular contributor to that magazine, Merrill Marco. The American Bystander has writing, comics, illustrations, gags, just humor by a ton of amazing talent, including Merrill, Drew Friedman, Roz Chast, M.K. Brown, Sam Gross, Seymour Quast, John Cuneo, R.O. Bleckman, Shannon Wheeler, Peter Cooper, Mimi Pond, Ken Crimstein, and a ton of people I haven't recorded with yet, like Al Jean, Liana Fink, Todd Hansen, Howard Cruz, Ed Sorel, who someday I'm going to get on the show, Zoe Matheson, Zach Handy, Stephen Brodner, a million other people. It's really an incredible list of contributors that he's got. And, well, because we've got a ton of overlapping interests and pals like this, I've wanted to sit down with Michael for a while now and find out about the history of the Bystander, how he launched it, what keeps him going, what brought him here. So during my August trip out to L.A. and San Diego, Michael and I got together at the Santa Monica Public Library and talked it out. Now, since that conversation, some other stuff has come up. In particular, issue number 8 has been delayed because the new printer got cold feet. It seems the company's owners are, quote-unquote, really Christian, and the printer rep Michael was working with was afraid they'd disapprove of the contents and fire him. Now, Michael wrote a good piece about it on the Patreon blog for The Bystander, and then Boing Boing picked it up a day or so later, which I hope led to some subscriptions, and also a lot of conversation about what censorship can consist of in this day and age. Now, there'll be a link to the Boing Boing and Bystander blog piece in the show notes for this episode, so make sure you check those out. Oh, there'll also be a link to Operation Waterfall, a video that the Bystander smuggled out of Russia about Trump's infamous P-tape. The other thing, Michael talks extensively during the conversation about the Trump's KGB file parody project, and I'll give you an update on that at the end of the episode. Now, as far as caveats go, we recorded this in a study room at a public library, so there's some noise outside. Also, it is Bill Shelley, not Bill Sheft, who wrote the Harvey Kurtzman biography. Oh, and we get kicked out of the room at one point, so there's a break. I'll clue you in on that. Now, here's a brief bio. Michael Gerber has been writing, editing, and publishing successful humor magazines since 1989. His comedy books have sold 1.25 million copies in 25 languages. In his spare time, he teaches flatulent, shambolic college students how to run humor magazines for fun and profit. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Michael Gerber. May as well start, but we'll go basic with your publishing history and what led to The Bystander and your involvement with it, which I know is an enormous opening sort of thing, but, you know. Yeah,
but I have kind of a spiel about it because people ask.
Your elevator version.
So as your readers our listeners may or may not know, The Bystander was originally a project that Brian McConaughey started in the early 80s. And he got a lot of his friends from SCTV and Saturday Night Live to put some money in. And they had it's a very sort of old-fashioned way to do a magazine. They had an office in New York, and they got a bunch of young talent, and they got as far as a pilot issue. So there is a printed pilot issue of the first Bystander,
which Patrick McDonald showed me 2 years ago, or a year and a half ago when I went to I had no idea about the original version.
Really?
Because he said, I heard your stuff about The Bystander. Here's the original issue. I'm staring at him like, is this some fake artifact from
that we created?
It was from like 2016, and yeah.
No. But, I'd heard about as I'm going to say this, it's going to sound crazy, but as the world's only expert on print humor magazines, I'd heard about The Bystander as like this great what might have been. Because what happened, as far as I can tell, is that they got to the pilot issue stage, and anybody who's in the magazine business will tell you that, to get on the newsstands, the next step for them would be getting on the newsstands. To do that, you have to have $10,000 in unmarked bills that you give to a guy named Vinny.
No, magazine distribution wasn't controlled by underworld elements at all.
Right. And what I was amazed, being a sort of good suburban kid from the Midwest, is that when I did a parody of the Wall Street Journal in 1996, I was talking to a newsstand consultant in a bar in Hell's Kitchen, and his first question was to me, of course you have your paper bag money. And I said, paper bag money?
Why?
So I think I think they got to the stage where they really needed
money laundering.
Serious.
Yes, I'm sorry. Yeah.
They really needed serious dough, and they couldn't raise it. I think there was a recession. And then Brian and I haven't really talked about this. I think it's very painful for him. Mm-hmm. That's my guess, but having worked with Brian for the years now, that's my guess. I think also the fact that John Belushi died in 1982. That was around the time that The Bystander really didn't happen. It was on the cusp of happening, and it didn't happen. So how I got involved, like I said, I'm sort of the world's only expert on humor magazines, print humor magazines. And so I had run across Brian I probably sent him a parody of A Christmas Carol that I did just for myself in 2008. I love that book, so I, did one, and I sent it around to people I knew and some people I wanted to know and all that sort of thing. I was really ill at that time in my life, so I didn't really leave my house very much. So in any case, Brian and I knew each other from that. He read it, he liked it. Then I arranged for him to speak at Yale. I ran the humor magazine at Yale called the Yale Record. That's a whole other story.
Which we'll get to.
Yeah, and it's quite an interesting story, I think. But in any case, around 2012, Brian and a friend of his named Alan Goldberg, who is the third partner at Bystander, started calling me up, and they wanted to figure out how to do a radio show. They have a radio show called Big Ship Radio, which is funny. It's very Brian. It's very kind of National Lampoon Radio Hour sort of things. And so I said, so they called me because they knew that I had started things and done stuff like that. And I said to them right off, I don't know how to do a radio show, but I'll certainly see if I can help. And then it really got to the point where I said, well, I don't know how to do a podcast either, but if we do a magazine, I suspect we can get a podcast out of that. Mm-hmm. So Brian and Alan said, okay, well, let's investigate doing a magazine. Is this going to bug you?
Oh, no, this is fine. Drew Friedman and I recorded in the 2nd Avenue Deli.
No kidding. I had no idea.
Go check the first one I did with Drew.
Yeah.
He called me in the morning, emailed me in the morning, said, my wife and I are going to be in New York. Let's meet at the 2nd Avenue Deli.
Oh, that's perfect.
Of all people. Yeah. There's Yenta's, dishes clattering, and Drew telling stories about Sammy Petrillo.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
That's when I knew I'd arrived.
I got to say, when I was really sick, one of the few things that I could eat was kosher deli, was like pastrami and corned beef. Mm-hmm. So I remember one trip, this was after I'd done my parody of Harry Potter. I was going to New York to look for a new agent. And I basically, over that week, went to every big kosher deli in New York City to find out which one I liked the best. So I went to the 2nd Avenue Deli, I went to the Stage Deli, I went to the Carnegie, I went to Katz's, of course. And I think there was another one I'm not thinking of. But of them all, I think I like Carnegie best.
Yeah?
Yeah. What's yours?
Generally Katz.
Really?
But Katz is so goddamn busy. It's
Well, and
I'm also a tongue guy, so that's part of my.
I've heard that about you.
I mean, I go to tongue. It's my verbal fetish, I guess.
That's funny.
It's the rare occasions I get, to do kosher deli.
If I had known, literally across the street is a place called Wexler's.
I passed it. I parked right next to it, so I was going to grab some on the way out when I head back to. Well, the problem is I'm recording with Moby right after this, and if I show up smelling of deli meat, this could be a problem. But
yes,
still,
right.
We'll see how it comes out.
And he'll have like a sixth sense for that.
Yeah, he'll say, nope, not in my house.
Yeah. So anyway, back to the bystander. So these guys were calling me, and they were asking me how, all sorts of, starting from the most basic questions to the most specific questions. And like I say, I was really ill, so I couldn't really talk very long. So they would start out and they would say, well, if you were going to publish it, how would you do it? And I would say, okay, let me think about that. And then I would think for a week or two, like, okay, how could you publish a print humor magazine in the era of the internet? Well, it would have to be, you'd have to ask the readers to pay what it actually costs. You couldn't do all the sort of mumbo jumbo that big magazines do. It would have to be a precious object. It would have to be valuable feeling. It would have to be heavy. And so slowly but surely over the course of that first year, I was thinking about, well, how could you pay for it? What would it look like? What would it feel like? And then they're like, well, who would you get for it? Which kind of people? And that's when, you and I were talking earlier about David Levine. I've just been such a fan of these people for so long that I was starting to collect a list. Well, you definitely get this person and that person and this person and that person. And I was also looking at the early bystander from 82, that pilot, and saying, well, who did you get? Okay, well, yeah, that person certainly. Yeah, that person, okay. And, even between the launch of the first issue of Bystander in 2016 and now, there have been considerable numbers of people who have died. So that's kind of part of my job, too.
Yeah, it's actually a question I had.
Yeah. You want to blast through this and then let me blast?
Well, yeah, okay. but it is just one to keep in mind. Who did you want to get who you didn't get a chance to get before they died?
Well, David Levine is a perfect example.
Yeah.
I mean, he's the tremendous example because when I would go and talk to Arnold Roth in the early 90s, because I've been trying to do a national print humor magazine since I graduated college in 91. So I went directly down to New York and started asking rich people for money. And that's how I got to be known as the person who's the crazy print humor magazine person.
Weird guy who keeps showing
Totally. So yeah, David Levine was certainly one. A friend of mine named Cordy Bryan, CDB Bryan, was somebody. He was a Yale record person, and there were a bunch of Yale record people that I was interested in. Gosh. I tend to, I'd have to think about it more. But, like John Caldwell was in the old Bystander, and we were talking about having a bunch of his stuff in Bystander as it continued, and he passed away suddenly. Robert Grossman was a good friend of mine and passed away suddenly in March. And so, part of what's going on with me with Bystander is we're trying to collect and broadcast this specific kind of culture before the people who know how to do it properly all pass away.
How do you characterize or categorize that culture? What sort of humor do you call this?
Well, okay, my taste is extremely Catholic, and I'm a little different than most humor magazine editors. Most humor magazines come about when you get 3 or 4 funny people who have very much the same sense of humor. Mm-hmm. They come together and then they create a magazine. And either you like that or you don't. And so something like Kurtzman's Mad. And I have a Kurtzman story too. Should I tell you my Kurtzman story right now?
Yeah.
So in the early 90s, I had the idea after resurrecting and running Yale's old humor magazine, the Yale Record. So I went down to New York and was determined to start a national college humor magazine inserted inside college newspapers. Mm-hmm. And this was in 91, and so it was pre-internet. I mean, that was actually a viable business. So I was searching around. It was very similar to what I did with the Bystander in 2012 to 2015, kind of collecting both the old men and women and then the younger men and women and sort of trying to put them together in one book. And because I was friends with Arnold Roth, who is a wonderful, generous guy. We were talking about generous people before. There's nobody more generous than him. Drew's that generous too. Yeah. So Arnold, I was asking him, well, who should I get? And of course he said Harvey. And I was interested in talking to Harvey. I've always felt what might have been with Harvey more than anything else. I like the early years of Mad, but I think the rest of his career...
It's a question that's come up with a few of my
guests. Well,
Little Annie Fanny.
Yes.
Or should we be happy that we at least have that? Or should we be sad that we didn't get what Harvey could have done?
Well, Harvey reminds me of Lenny Bruce in the same way. Mm-hmm. Because, you think to your people in the comedy business will say, oh, what might have been if Lenny Bruce had lived? And if you read about Lenny Bruce had checked out by 1964. And what's so interesting about that is that as the culture turned to him, as the culture turned to his type of material, there was something about the mechanism that didn't work for him anymore, and maybe he had to be oppositional.
Once he was inside the fence.
Yeah. Because when he would talk about the hippies, he wouldn't understand them. People would say, oh, you can make a ton of money, and he wouldn't get it. There would be no juice to it. I didn't know Harvey at all, really, but I wonder if there wasn't something like that around the time the culture changed, 65, 66, Gilliam is like the last guy that you could see could really understand. And Gilliam is like, for example, Bob Grossman, all these people at the Yale Record who I knew their work from the late 50s, early 60s. It's very different than the hippie stuff. And so anyway, getting back to my Harvey story, I wrote Harvey, shaking as I typed, because I really wanted to sit down and figure out what he knew. Not about being funny, not about cartooning. I wasn't interested in that. I was interested in humor magazine structure and pacing and how to connect with audience and all the things that he could do very well. And what's interesting is that was it Bill Sheff that wrote the biography of Harvey?
Yeah.
I found out, I always sensed Harvey's Mad always reminded me of a college humor magazine. That's where I felt it came from. And sure enough, he is quoted in that biography as saying, I found some Yale records in a trash bin in 1929 or whatever it was. And I go, yeah, because if you take college humor and you give it a little bit of Jewish soul, that you get early Mad. Well, plus the great art. I mean, there's that too. Yeah. Plus there's people like, Will Elder and stuff. So anyway, I wrote Harvey this letter. I'm sure it was impassioned. I don't have it. But he wrote me back. It's this tiny little scrap of yellow paper, like by your phone.
Yeah.
And he wrote it in pencil. It's very light pencil. And he said, it sounds like a great project and you sound like a great guy, but I have some problems that I'm drowning in and I can't help you. Mm-hmm. And I only learned later that I think around that time was the time that he got diagnosed with, was it pancreatic cancer or whatever killed him, which was really awful. Mm-hmm. So that was my only really interaction with Harvey. I met his daughter in the publishing business about 15 years later and made sure to say, your dad meant a lot to me. But in any case, that was, I'm kind of uniquely positioned to do what I'm doing because I can I'm really comfortable with stuff before 1970 and also with after 1970. Mm-hmm. And so I can connect with, we were talking about Ed Sorel, my heroes, of course my heroes are people like Doug Kenny and Henry Beard, and all the rest of you guys, if you're listening, they're my heroes too. But also, people like Seymour Quast, Milton Glaser, Ed, Jim McMullen, all the pushpin guys. So that's weird because generally you don't have people running humor magazines who are as much about the art or as much about the design or as interested in that.
How much of a challenge is that in terms of managing the, we'll say content, which is a terrible word, but both the prose, the gag panels, the sequential comics, and the illustration?
The management of it?
Yeah, editing that, getting that into a flow, figuring out how to lay out an issue so that it's not too, that it has a rhythm, basically.
That's the hardest thing about it. Mm-hmm. That's the thing that I'm proudest of about it. Because if I told you the amount of material that comes at me every day, you'd throw up. I mean, it's just, I've got 200 people who've contributed so far. I'm always trying to get more. And I'm always trying to make it feel right in that way, give it a spread. Because the thing is, I was saying this earlier, people generally, humor magazines, if you look at the Kurtzman's Mad, it's Harvey and his buddies. If you look at the first 5 years of National Lampoon, it's Doug and Henry and their buddies. It's Spy. It's one very particular flavor. And if you hit it, and it's great, and they're really talented people, so those magazines worked. The problem is, and this is the interesting thing about Bystander, is that I was talking to the guys before we even started. I said, look, the internet means that you, as a reader, can get to anything you want in 2 clicks. So this idea that we can come up with some particular style that isn't going to be already reflected in the culture, to me, is a losing proposition. So what are you going to do instead? Well, what you're going to do instead is you're going to try to have the most interesting, the most sort of skilled practitioners of what you're trying to get and putting them all together, and then through editing, make it all hang together. Now, just saying that makes smoke come out of my ears, but that's, so as I grew stronger, as I grew healthier, I'd found something that actually saved my life. It's a kind of acupuncture. So I was getting stronger, and I was starting to, the guys would ask me, well, how would the covers be? Well, would you mock up one of those? Well, how would the front section be? Well, would you do a mock up of those? And I was doing the magazine with the idea that I would do it. I would do the dummy, and then I would give it to Brian and say, Brian.
I did the same thing about my trade association. I thought,
really?
Well, I'll just get it off the ground and then hand it off to someone.
To Brian?
No, but someone else. 4.5 years later, I quit my job, became a lobbyist, etc. So I know how these things grow out of control.
So that actually reassures me, because I thought it was just my...
No, we're micromanaging control freaks. That's what it is.
Well, so anyway, bit by bit, the first issue comes together. Mm-hmm. And we had a possible deal where we were going to get $1 million from a bunch of Chinese businessmen, and that all fell through because that stuff always falls through. And then in mid-2015, I was sitting there with a completed first issue, and I thought, well, okay, I'll crowdfund it, but I didn't think that we would we would raise any money, because of course I'd worked in the publishing business for 25 years, and everybody in the publishing business is always saying print is dead and print humor is dead and you're an idiot and all the rest of that stuff. And after a couple of decades, you begin to believe them. So I had this issue. I was naked, and I was naked because it was early in the morning, and I was like, okay, maybe this will be lucky for some reason. And I pushed the go on the Kickstarter, and it turned out that it is lucky. So every time I launch a Kickstarter, I do the same thing.
Gotta go naked.
I gotta go naked. But in any case, we did raise that money, which I was really pleased about, because I'd really thought I was just going to do that first issue, print up 100, give them to all the people who we'd asked for material. It would be a nice thing to have on their shelf, and and they would, they're nice, and we were.
Yeah.
It was like, hey, thank you for your effort. But it turned out that people really wanted it. And so I did the second and the third and the fourth and the fifth, and now we're just about to release the eighth. And the interesting thing is that first issue, those first couple of issues feel more like books. And they feel more like books because I thought they were going to be one-offs.
Yeah.
I had to take everything
that I had.
You wanted
to bring as much as you could.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I had one shot, and so now they feel much more like magazines, and I think readers are reassured by that. It's so interesting because readers they have a relationship with books and magazines that are not quite conscious. And so that's what's interesting about design and pacing. I've just been obsessed with all of this stuff for so long that I kind of know it. But every issue that comes out, people say, oh, this one's better. This one's the best. And I think what they're getting is, I think they're just getting acclimated to how it looks. It's designed in a very particular way. It's paced in a very particular way. And frequently, before I do the sequencing or something like that, I'll go to this very library that we're in and go and look at the old bound editions of Harold Hayes' Esquire from the late 60s, mid to late 60s. I also have some Playboy. And of course I have a bunch of, Yale records and stuff like that. The classic magazine pacing. And so that's what we're trying to do with Bystanders, classic magazine pacing. You don't see that anymore. So, and I think that's what people respond to in a lot of ways.
Yeah, because a typical magazine is going to be driven by the advertisers, and the advertisers are vanishing. So you end up with, let's cut it down to 32 pages and put it on toilet paper, and we'll wonder why we're losing readership.
Yeah, right.
Who is a target audience?
There isn't one.
Okay. I was racking my brain over that one, trying to figure out who is.
I can tell you who reads it, which I'll tell you in a second. But this project was really put together as a package for editorial, and that's exactly the opposite of how big magazines are published. They're published to service a bunch of advertisers who want a particular demo. So, if you want men 18 to 34, what do men 18 to 34 like? Well, they like cars, and they like energy drinks, and they like MMA fighting, and they like, breasts. And that's how you get Maxim. So a part of why magazine culture, print magazine culture, is so decayed in the United States is it's not for readers. It's never really been for readers. Actually, that's not true. The great American magazines you can see they are for readers because they have such a vigorous conversation going on between the magazine and the readers. And I'm thinking Kurtzman's Early Mad, that's a perfect example of that. But it's not really fair because it's not advertising supported. But,
you see it with some great magazines, but those are ones where you're going to separate the editing and the publishing.
That's right. Well, so for example, the New Yorker for most of its history before Condé bought it, that is the wall between editorial and publishing was a mile thick. With something like Hayes' Esquire, the interesting thing is that Gingrich, there wasn't this huge wall, as far as I can tell. But because Gingrich was also an editor, I think that he saw what he had.
Sort of respected it?
Yeah, he sort of saw what he had when he had Clay Felker and Harold Hayes. But then when it was just Hayes, I think he backed off and let him do his thing. The guys at National Lampoon, there was no expectation really that magazine would succeed. So Maddie basically said, "You're a bunch of crazy college kids, go for it." Spy, I think it was the same. I don't know much about the inner workings of Spy. I have to ask Kurt about that at some point. But But yeah, with Bystander, really what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to create a cult. I'm trying to create a small group of people who really love what we're doing. I'm trying to give them as intense an experience as I can give them, as much value as I can give them, as much talent as I can give them. And so that's a totally new way of looking at magazines. It's not how it's done. Mm-hmm. And I'm amazed that it works, but it does. It works.
Yeah. Before we get to the actual mechanisms of how it's working, how does one become an expert on print humor magazines, or become the only expert on print humor magazines?
Yeah, well, there's a reason that I'm the only, which is that it makes you no money. There's no job there.
Yeah. You say to the guy who's sitting here with a pair of microphones.
But there's no job there. I mean, if I showed you my finances, you'd throw up. I mean, it's like, I just was writing somebody. We're just about to do a first big book project. It's called Donald Trump's KGB file. And I was talking to somebody and I said, the only way you can do a project like that, or the Harry Potter parody I did in 2002, is, can I swear?
Yeah.
You just can't give a fuck. You have to do the project. You have to love what that form and try to, I've always looked at print humor as a way, in even print humor editing, as a form of artistic expression. And that's just very weird. I'm born in 1969, so it was weird when I was in college, much less, 25 years later. So how does one get to be that? Well, I can tell you this, and it's very strange. When I was growing up, my mother raised me herself for my first 7 years, and she was in art school in St. Louis in the early 70s. And so all of her friends were artists and writers. And so being an only child and being a precocious talker, as you can hear now, I hung out with a lot of adults and a lot of college kids. And they all were reading National Lampoon. So I was looking at issues of National Lampoon at age 3 and 4 and 5 years old. This is, 72, 73, 74, 75. The really good years when they were really hitting their stride with their original crew and Kenny and Beard and O'Donohue and all that. So for some reason I connected with that. And I started asking my mother's friends to do drawings for me. Illustrate cartoons. Okay, in this panel, this person's going to say that, and that person's going to say that. Okay, in the next panel, this person's going to happen. This is going to do this, and that person's going to do that. It was basically editing. By the time I was 5, I was reading Mad. I'd started reading at 3, and just for some reason, humor and humor magazines were what I loved. So I used to carry around this little wicker suitcase. And I would take it when I would stay with my elderly aunt, or I had 2 aunts that were really instrumental in my growing up. One was my Aunt Peg, who was older, and another was my Aunt Mary, who was younger. So Mary was 21 and Peggy was 62. And so on Friday nights I would stay with Peg, the 61-year-old, and or 62-year-old, and then on Saturday nights I would stay with Mary, the 21-year-old.
And this isn't one of those, the person you think is your mother is actually your grandmother?
No,
just making sure there wasn't some weird family scandal that was about to come out. Okay.
I have my share of family scandals, but that's not one. But in any case, I'd take this little wicker basket with all the things that I wanted to stay over, and invariably I'd have my Mad magazines. And at about 5, and I still have this, if we were doing this in my apartment, I would show this to you. I was ripping apart issues of Mad magazine and taping them back together in the order that I wanted them. I don't know why, but that's what I was like as a kid. And so then, those years, Lampoon was doing really well, and then I was aware of Animal House. Saw that in the theaters at age 9. This is all like really inappropriate for the age.
I saw it on bootleg home video.
Did you?
A year or so after it came out. So I'm 2 years younger.
Okay, there you know.
My parents took me to History of the World Part 1.
Yes, of course.
So I was 9 seeing Mel Brooks' dirty movie, which I'm perfectly fine with, and they still think was educational somehow. But,
Can I just say, it's a rare day that I don't think, I wish Madeline Kahn were still alive.
Oh, God.
You know? I mean, there's just people that was a special generation. It really was. And that's another podcast to talk about how comedy changed after the early 80s when so many of those people who were driving it either stopped or had drug problems or died or all three. But anyway, so I was determined. I remember reading Robert Sam Anson's article about Doug Kenny after he died, The Life and Death of a Comic Genius, in Esquire magazine. And I thought to myself, oh, okay. So you can go to Harvard and go be on the Lampoon and all the rest of that stuff. Well, that's clearly what I'm going to do. You know, because I had been, my family didn't have any money. You know, when I was a little boy, we were staying with my grandmother, and all these, you know, all my aunts and my mom and I were staying with my grandmother who worked in the post office. But it was clear that I was precocious. And so I remember one day my mom and I were driving in her old VW Bug, that had so many ashtray fires, the radio was melted. So we called it the Klaus Oldenburg, vehicle. It's an art school joke for you. But anyway, we pull up next to behind a car that has a Harvard sticker on it. And my mother says, oh, you know, Mike, someday, I'm like 3, someday you're going to go there. With the assumption that like,
you're going to be a janitor? Or
the assumption that like, and we're all going to work together to get out of this mess that we're in. But I remember I was so little, I turned to my mom and I said, can you come too? You know, and my mom tells that story. But so I was aimed at, coming from St. Louis, which is an interesting city. It's Eastern looking. Mm-hmm. If you go west from St. Louis, it's all then Western looking. But St. Louis is more like Baltimore or Philadelphia or Pittsburgh. It's not the East Coast, but it's aware of it. Mm-hmm. And my mother was waitressing in bars in St. Louis to make money that were these literary bars. One was Llewellyn's, the other's O'Connell's. They're still around. And they were all newspaper people. And so I would sit at the bar while she was finishing her shift and talk to all these newspaper people. And so I was focused on the East Coast, too, from an absurdly early age. Literary culture. That's what I wanted to be a part of. So after reading this Robert Sam Anson article, I'm like, okay, all right, I think I know what I want to do. And in high school, I just was filling notebooks. I was filling spiral notebooks like the one you see here. My trick is I buy the notebook as cheaply as possible. So I write a book or do a magazine that makes me money, and I say, see, I spent $1 on the notebook and $1 on the pen. You know, I was drafted, I guess, onto my high school newspaper. I went to a big public high school outside of Chicago called Oak Park River Forest High School. It's a very good school. That's why we moved there to Oak Park. My wife also went there. It's another long story. But anyway, it has a good high school newspaper, one of the best, and called The Trapeze. And I'm saying that specifically if there are any alumni listening. But I was sort of cajoled into writing a humor column for them because my friends were reading my stuff and saying, this is hilarious. I was reading old stuff. I was reading Benchley, Thurber, Perelman, Dorothy Parker, you know, those people. And then writing, you know, piece after piece after piece. So wrote a column in my high school newspaper. And I think that's what got me into Yale because I had good grades. And I have a slight case of cerebral palsy, which gave my application color. Yeah. But I walked into my freshman year, being slightly disabled. I scored a first floor room, and I walked into the rotunda of Bingham Hall, which is one of the buildings on the old campus at Yale. And I heard somebody say from the third floor, "Hey, are you Mike Gerber?" "Yes." Did you go to Park River Forest High School? Yes. Did you write for the Trapeze? Yes. We used to read your humor columns all the time. That's the kind of, I say the story because that's the kind of thing that I don't know if that would happen anymore. Maybe it would. Maybe people would, maybe it'd be easier. Maybe high school kids are getting followings because of what they're writing.
Now it's all Twitter followers.
Yeah. But
that's a different type of humor.
It totally is. And I'm not on Twitter, and I don't like it.
Yeah.
I don't like it.
I was going to ask, because that's not how much of the bystander is a response/reaction to internet
100% of it.
humor.
100% of it. Not that there's anything wrong with internet humor, but
it's a specific type.
Yeah, and it's essentially, I mean, my problem with the internet is this: it promises diversity, but what it gives you is monoculture. Mm-hmm. So you know what it's like. You go to a newsstand in the 80s and you'd see a gajillion magazines. You'd see 4 general interest news weeklies, each with a slightly different bent, from right wing to left wing to center to whatever. Now, basically, what do you got? You got Slate, and that's one thing. You got you got 2 newspapers, New York Times and Wall Street, or that's 3, I guess. New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. I have to say, I think we're going to look back on this period and see that the internet was an extinction level event for certain types of American culture. And for what? So that a few white guys from good schools could get incredibly wealthy? I don't see the I don't see the cultural benefit of it. And they're always talking about the cultural benefits of, as I say, they promise diversity, but what they give is monoculture. So with Bystander, this stuff isn't going to exist if you don't do it. And as somebody who, so we'll get back to my wonderful story. So I get to Yale, see to my horror that the Yale Record, which is actually the oldest college humor magazine in the country, is in and out of business after Gary Trudeau left. And I'm like, what is that about? Because, of course, I look at this and go, what's the point of going to a school like this if you're not going to really kind of engage with the history of it? You can get a good education I could have gotten a good education at the University of Illinois. It's like, so for the first 2 years, I did a humor column for the weekly there called the Yale Herald. And the Yale Herald had just started, so it allowed me really to do whatever I wanted. And by the end of my sophomore year, I was doing like 12-page parodies in a 20-page newspaper and getting successful in that, getting a lot of acclaim and all the rest of that stuff. But of course, the people who were running the newspaper are like, this is maybe not what we want. Yeah. So I was essentially kicked off of that.
Gerber Weekly.
Exactly, right? And like just cranking stuff out. Because the other interesting thing was I came along right at the same time as printing and publishing technology changed from
manual to digital. And that was, I worked in trade magazines from 95 onwards. And had it not made that transition.
I've heard you talk about this.
Yeah. I could not have gotten a job because I would assemble a magazine that looked like a serial killer had made it. But luckily, Quark, PageMaker, etc., saved me from serial killing. I mean, from another job.
So, that is one of the biggest sort of determiners of my whole career, is that I could then look at magazines like Fellini looks at movies. And I love Fellini. So it's like, well, how's it going to look? How many pages is it going to be? What's the typeface going to be? How, what are the illustrations going to be? I could kind of direct
look at something and reverse engineer something.
Yeah. But like I say, look at it like a movie director looks at it. To sort of create an entire experience. So with Bystander, what you're doing is you're creating an entire experience. You're saying, come with me. And, it's everything from the typefaces. I did 10 or 15 full type tests for Bystander before we launched. How's it work with Weiss? How's it work with Walbaum? How's it work with Garamond? How's it work with blah, blah, blah? So what I ended up picking for Bystander was ITC Caslon 224. And I picked it particularly because it was designed by Ed Ben-Ghiat. I've never said his name before, so I don't know if it's right. In 1982.
Oh, so you've got a heritage.
And what I wanted with the print edition of the Bystander was I wanted it to harken back to the what I consider to be the apogee of American print culture, which is late 70s, early 80s. If you look at, say, for example, the designs of the op-ed page in the New York Times in the late 70s, early 80s, you're like, wow, these are great. I mean, big illustration by great people, plus, like really lively, interesting pages. So anyway, I go to Yale, I get kicked off the paper, I end up resurrecting the Yale Record. Mm-hmm. And because I'm a crazy person, I was basically, with one hand trying to get as many people as involved as I could, which meant rewriting people because nobody had really, they hadn't spent their preteen and teen years writing Benchley parody, Benchley pastiches. Yeah. But I was like, okay, I got 2 years here and I want to make sure it continues after I leave. So, just absolutely 40 plus hours a week on the magazine, plus a full load at Yale. Crazy. I don't know how I did it.
What were you studying?
History.
Okay.
And see, this is the interesting thing, because for me, I love history. And I often think, well, I had a fork in the road, that I could either be a historian or a comedy writer. And I remember I'm fascinated with with American history in the post-war period, but particularly from the 50s to 1950 to 1980. And I remember at Yale you had to do and you still have to do a big paper for your monograph, basically for your degree. And so I wanted to do for the history major, I wanted to do a monograph on the psychological effects of the Kennedy assassination. I was obsessed with the Kennedy assassination from age 5 to age 42 when I abruptly stopped. But
you solved it? I'm just kidding.
I have a pretty good idea of what I think happened, but but I also came to the conclusion that there's no way to.
Have you read Ron Rosenbaum's essay on the labyrinth? I'll send you a copy.
Yeah. I actually meter myself very hard on that.
Yeah. Because it's not about the conspiracy so much as what it is. In Ron's great era, he would not write about the phenomenon, but what our interpretations of the phenomenon were. So what it means that we are building all of these alternate theories and conspiracies about it.
See, I think that's what's interesting about it, too. I think there's a murder mystery element of it, which, of course, is fascinating. If you're that turn of mind, then that's what you focus on. But for me, I'm really interested in the effect. And so I went to a then junior professor at Yale who was interested in the same stuff. And I remember talking to him and saying, listen, I'd like to do this paper. And Yale's a particularly good place at that time. It was a particularly good place to do that because a lot of the people who were involved in CIA at that period of time.
Sure. You would have had
I might not have been able to get to them directly, but my girlfriend's father was a good friend of Robin Winks, who was a professor at Yale, and he's sort of the major professor or major sort of scholar of the connection between the American intelligence community and academia. And so through Professor Winks, I at least have a shot of talking to James Angleton or, whoever I would want to talk to. But I remember talking to this professor, this junior professor, and saying, this is what I'd like to do. And he said, well, what do you think happened? This is in 1990. Before the JFK movie, before the records had been released or anything like that. I said, to be frank, I don't think we're ever going to know. I think there was a period of time when we could have found out, but that was probably over by 1967. I think by 1967, the trail was cold enough, the evidence was weird enough that you're never going to know for sure. But I suspect that the Warren Commission is not what happened. And I remember he looked at me and he laughed and he said, do you have any other ideas for a senior essay? And I said, well, I'd like to do a history of the humor magazine that I resurrected, the Yale Record. He said, do that instead. And so it's interesting. I always remember that, and I do talk about that talk. And I'm still friends with that professor who I admire and has had a good career. Who I think was authentic in his love of that period. But what I got from his response was that period is still too political to really go anywhere you want to go.
Sure.
You have to judge that politically. And I'm not interested in doing history if I can't tell the truth, as I see it. And so it really came down to, at age 21, I had to choose between comedy, where I felt I really could tell the truth or a truth, or history, where I felt like the history that I loved, I couldn't talk about that. I could talk about the 1800s and tell the truth, but it wasn't,
didn't grab you.
It wasn't, to me, who cares? I mean, interesting, yes, but like, you're talking about, you can't understand Reagan without understanding the 70s.
First order effects.
You can't understand the 70s without understanding the 60s. You can't understand what's happened in the United States since 1963 without acknowledging that when you talk to people about November 22nd, 1963, it was a trauma, a personal trauma. So you can't understand Donald Trump. You can't understand the turning of the American electorate towards people like this, or whatever issue you're trying to address, without going back to that root cause. And because that root cause has been made radioactive, we're children. We're children. We're walking around going, who knows what's happening for who knows what reason? And so...
Truth isn't truth.
And so what's interesting about that is that I noticed truth isn't truth. That's exactly right.
It came up yesterday from our...
I noticed something interesting in the 90s and then in the 2000s. That there was a group of people who I knew at Yale who ended up, Steve Bodo, who I knew at Yale, ended up being the showrunner for The Daily Show. Alison Silverman, who I knew at Yale, ended up being the showrunner for The Colbert Report. I was doing what I was doing. In the 90s, I was editing or being a magazine consultant, specializing in humor and writing. I did a 20-page parody of the Wall Street Journal, which is my own version of The Bystander, 1982. It's like I have a stack of them in my room. I think that a lot of people turned to comedy in the early 90s, the late 80s, early 90s, because I think that they felt that there was something increasingly fraudulent about the official narrative, the histories that we were being taught, the news that we were being given. And so I think that comedy, and ever since, because that's really a lot of what The Onion is about, and of course a lot of Onion people that I work with the Bystander, and now with this Donald Trump's KGB file, we've got Scott Dickers and Mike Lowe and Todd Hansen and all those people. I'm really assembling a dream team to try to figure out what the fuck is going on. How did we get to this place? And so, I don't have a natural affinity for video. I like it. I can do it. I can do scripts and stuff like that. But my natural affinity is for print. Unfortunately, print started to die, or was dying, and then was accelerated. Its death has been accelerated by print. So, but I still love it, and I can't be different than I am. So it's just years and years of reading magazines, and after I graduated from Yale, I still stayed connected with the Yale Record, and every 3 or 4 years would go up and teach the staff, this is how you do it. This is how you sequence a magazine. This is how you design a magazine. For 20 years, I ran the alumni group, and now I'm the treasurer, and somebody else runs it, and I just ask people for money. But that print culture, that sort of American century print culture, is what I'm interested in. And what I really see with Donald Trump is he's the end of the American century. From 1914 to 2016, that's over. Whatever's going to happen next is going to be different. Is it going to be better? Could be better. I'd like to think that it's going to be better, that this is a wake-up call, that we're going to go, holy shit, we've got, civic virtue as in ancient Rome. Ancient Rome is another one of my obsessions.
Yeah.
Civic virtue or the civic duty is not bullshit. You have to do it. Maybe we'll get to that point. Maybe we'll finally finish the process that we started in the 60s and early 70s. Or maybe we won't. And that's kind of, what I'm so interested in. For 2 years, I've been trying to figure out, how do you address Donald Trump from a comedic standpoint? How do you keep from normalizing him and talking about his hair and that he's fat and he's gross and all the rest of that stuff? He may or may not be all those things to your opinion, but that's not what's important about him. Mm-hmm. So for me, what I like about this Donald Trump's KGB file idea is that it allows me to talk about really anything. It's a mosaic with him in the middle. It's all reflecting light on him. It doesn't have to be about him. So it's really going to be an interesting project. The souffle maybe won't rise. By the time that this comes out, maybe we will have pulled the plug on the project and say, it's too hard, I can't do it, or, I got to go make some money doing something or whatever. But in these first 3 weeks, it strikes me as something that I think is worthy of real comic attention at the highest level.
I have 2 questions about it. One, is it Bystander branded?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's the American Bystander Presents.
2.
So I'm just bringing in a dream team.
All the contributors.
Yeah.
2.
Which is not how I do things.
Yeah.
How I do things is I plan it from scoop to nuts. How big is the book going to be? Mm-hmm. What are the typefaces? What's the leading? It's crazy. But it's like Fellini in movies. You're trying to create the entire experience. Now, the challenge with the Trump thing is I don't have to edit people hard on Bystander. I edit by how I pick them.
Yeah.
So if I pick
it's already,
exactly.
The curation of it is the editing.
So if I pick Ed Sorel, I'm not telling Ed what to write.
Yeah, Arnold Roth, same thing. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So with this, and I just said this because I've just opened it up to the staff in total last afternoon, I said, I'm going to have to edit you tighter. But I've sold 1.25 million books in 25 different languages worldwide, so you're in good hands.
You trust me on this.
Exactly. And so what I think is so amazing about editing is that, yes, it's great to be a writer, and I enjoy writing, and I enjoy, like the Barry Trotter book and all the other of the 10 novels that I've done or whatever. I like that. I think people enjoy them. But I'm always trying to look at somebody who's super, super talented, who hasn't gotten really good editing, an artist who hasn't gotten really good editing, or a writer, because the level of editing in the publishing business, there are good editors. But because there cannot be a discrete monetary value on editing, you're going to make 25% more money if it's better edited, then there's been tremendous pressure for my entire adult life for publishing houses and publications to get rid of editors.
Right.
Because they don't, so...
we see the same thing in newspapers. We'll get rid of the photographers. We can just let the reporters take pictures on their iPhone, and we can just run that.
Exactly.
Because no one's going to care.
And
is
so,
how they see
a lot of with Bystander is, it's with people like Ed or Arnold Roth or Mike Reese or Al Jean or any of those, George Meyer, Neil Scoville, Merrill Marco. I'm not editing their writing or drawing. But with somebody who is 24, I'm definitely sort of nudging them in ways that I think would be beneficial to them. And I'm always saying this to them, how do I accelerate your growth? How do I get you to that place where you get to the project that is like your Barry Trotter, where you sell 1 million worldwide, or you do a book, or you do a television show that's great? I'm really interested in nurturing. And I think part of that's just part of my personality, but I've done it with the Yale students, and I do it with college kids. And when they come and ask specifically for the publishing, I came up with a publishing model for student publications, which if I wasn't doing Bystander and I was affiliated with a university, I would try to do that, because it's a publishing model where you can have a very few number of overworked, often intoxicated students and make money.
Yeah.
And that was because when I was at Yale, we were constantly losing money, and it was awful. And so through the 90s, I was working with the students and thinking, this is not going to get good until people can stop worrying about whether they're going to be able to pay for it. So in the 90s, as I was a magazine consultant, I started putting together this model, which is kind of a baby Bystander model. But it's great. And you could run it at any school and make money from issue 1. And it's only a question of how much money do you want to make. I also think what's great about it is that, unlike the internet, where the university is controlling the pipe, and if you do something the university doesn't like, they can say, you're done. That was loud. With print, there's not only a tradition of freedom of the press, there's also an expectation of freedom of the press. So if somebody tries to, for example, if Yale would never do this, try to shut down the Yale Record, or if Harvard tried to shut down the Lampoon, the alumni would go fucking berserk, and they should go fucking berserk.
Yeah.
So I'm an evangelist for print. And I think that it's going to come through, but I think that we haven't found the right model yet. I feel like we've just skated all around here.
Oh, there's 10 million things I still want to get at.
Is there anything else?
We still have, we're going to keep going until they kick us out of the room.
Yeah, but I just don't, I want to make sure that we talk about what you're interested in.
Well, there's going to be the question of diversity and how you get a diverse level of contributors. But to get back to the Trump thing,
okay. Don't lose that because I want to talk about that.
Oh, I've got it down here. This is one of the key issues I have because my show is so white male.
Yes.
It was just thrown in my face yesterday by a guest saying, I saw that big mosaic of guests you had there. A lot of white faces, a lot of male faces.
But here's the thing.
Yeah.
I'm disabled, so...
Yeah, you've got that
awesome, right?
I've got the white male thing, and I can't get away with it. But back to the Trump question, though.
Yeah.
To me, what characterizes this administration and the personality at the center of it is a lack of shame.
Yes. That's what makes him impossible to satirize.
And that's what I'm wondering. Developing humor around that when the subject of it at its core, there's no shame and there's no, I don't care what you say about me. I'll keep, we do know that he cares. We know that he cared when Melissa McCarthy played Sean Spicer, that there was something weird.
You know what he cares about? He cares about Russia.
Yeah.
We don't know why he cares about Russia. Maybe we'll never know why he cares about Russia. Maybe it's the grandest, darkest conspiracy that you could ever think of. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe literally it's nothing. But he cares about it because he thinks that it makes him illegitimate. And that's what made me think, a dossier is a great form, and it's going to be super graphic, and we're going to have pictures and, scrawls on napkins and everything. It's going to be great. And we're going to talk about things in 1977 New York, and we'll talk about things now. It's going to be awesome. And it's also likely to piss him off.
Yeah.
And that to me, and I don't really talk about my disability a lot, but I've been working, I do Qigong, which is a form of Chinese yoga for my health, but I'm also really interested in kind of whether I can work with my cerebral palsy with this kind of martial art. But in any case, the thing about Trump that really sticks in my craw is he made fun of that disabled reporter. I mean, what the fuck? That is so beyond the pale, not of political partisan.
No, human decency.
It's human decency.
Yeah.
And so you look at that guy and you say, okay, and in my heart of hearts, truly, I believe this. In my heart of hearts, I think Trump is probably a pretty decent fellow, but I think he's got no fucking impulse control. And if you're going to be president of the United States, you got to have impulse control. You got to read the room and go, is this really what I should be doing? So I really look at him as a clear and present danger to American democracy because he's making the way for people who really are not, who are shameless, who are not sort of, they don't acknowledge their responsibility to the tribe. Where, I just met you today and we were talking about, and you mentioned that you're Jewish earlier. It's my responsibility to the tribe is not to, start saying a bunch of anti-Semitic things. Even I don't believe them, but even if I did believe them, it's like that's not how proper people behave.
Yeah.
Right? And so every time he does something and gets that little teenage thrill of outraging the authorities, people, I just think it's a really bad development. And I think it has to do with the internet. I think this is the first comment section president.
Yeah. That's also the feedback loop.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, where it's just the instant gratification.
So, is this KGB Fall project going to be as good as I think it's going to be? God, I hope so. Mm-hmm. If it's not, I'm going to pull it. If it's not what I want, I'm going to pull it. Mm-hmm. But I do feel that it's important to... Parody is protected speech theoretically until someone uses it. When I did the Harry Potter parody in 2002, it was shopped to all the big publishers in the United States, and they all passed, and they all said the same thing. They said, we think this is really funny, but we think you're going to get sued by Warner Brothers. And I would say to them, but parody is protected speech. And they would say, lawsuits are expensive whether you win them or you lose them.
Sure.
Even my agent, the guy I had walking around the project, which was just some random guy I met, was saying, I don't think this is right. I think it's wrong to use typefaces that look like the same book, like the original book. And I'm like, dude, like, have you never read National Lampoon? That's the whole thing. Modern parody is a graphic parody.
Yeah, it has to have the look and feel.
It has to have the look and feel. And even something like The Onion has the look and feel of USA Today, because when it was coming up, 93, 94, 95, that was what it was parodying. So in any case, that was an object lesson that in the publishing business, unless you push the issue, they're not going to fight for your right to speak, whether it's satire, whether it's parody. So with somebody like Trump, particularly because he's demonizing the press, I feel it's important that we do use these forms, and we do them as directly as we can, so that if we have to test Falwell versus Hustler again, then we have to test it. And if it turns out that this right-wing Supreme Court says, no, that doesn't fit anymore, well, then we know that. And you can interview me next in prison or however it is. But that's the thing. You know, and I think that particularly with people in the arts, you know, I'll be blunt with you. You and I both know that if things continue going on for the next 20 years, even the next 10, the way that they're going, and the trains start to roll, people like me are going to be on them. So I got to speak now. And I got to get all my crew together and take the shot. One, to speak. This is what being an American's about. I'm very patriotic. This is what a patriot would do in my position. I'll take the risk, whatever that risk is. But the other thing is, you know, like, you also got to push it for the people coming next. And I think that this is really, really important. So we'll see if the project coalesces. It may, like I say, it may not coalesce. I may get a bunch of stuff and people are totally not getting it, and I don't have time to, because we're going to do it very quickly. We're going to get it out hopefully by October. We'll finish it by October, hopefully get it out by November. Don't know if we're going to have a conventional deal or a crowdfund or some mix of the two. I don't know. My agent is walking it around. But, you know, God damn it, this is important. And so we want it to be very, very, very funny. And we also want it to be very, very insightful about what has happened since 1980, because that is a historical thing that people are going to look back. You remember this, point in 97, 71, I remember this. 70s were different. Even the early 80s were different. The expectations that people had of their lives, the ability to make a living in the arts was different.
Sure.
I remember having a conversation with Louis Lapham once. He was saying, yeah, around 1980, that's when all the bankers, when I moved here, bankers and magazine editors basically made the same thing. In 1980, bankers started making more and more and more money. So part of what I'm trying to do with this project, and in general, is to say we have a choice. We can choose who we reward in this society. We can choose how we apportion the riches, and we are the richest country in the history of the world. And here in Santa Monica, you and I were waiting to get into the library, surrounded by homeless people.
Right.
What is that about?
All over L.A.
Exactly.
And yesterday also, same thing. I'm driving around like I have not seen this many homeless people in a long-ass time.
It is a non-functioning society. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important, if you're in the comedy business or you're a creative person or whatever, and you can do it in an entertaining way that will get past people's screen of, God, I'm so miserable anyway, then you give that a shot. And I think, you know, to a certain degree, that's what we're trying to do. Bystander, the issues themselves.
We're about to get kicked out.
Are we? Oh.
Wait 1 second. So, okay.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Don't worry. Right. We'll be out in 1 second.
Yeah, because somebody else is here.
Oh, God. Okay.
Don't worry. We're going to continue this in New York. But as it turned out, the guy who booked this room was willing to move to another one. So Michael and I got a few more minutes before I had to run to Silver Lake to record with Moby.
We've been reprieved.
Yeah. So they decided to find another room for the guy who needed a room. And
yeah,
we can get back to my question.
Yeah.
How do you work on diversity for the magazine? I know you have a lot of female contributors.
Not enough.
This is my worst year for male versus female split for guests.
Yes.
It is terrible.
Well,
how do you do that? How do you make sure there's diversity ethnically? Or do you have, just an internal guide, I suppose, that helps?
Well, here's what I would say about that. What I'm doing and what you're doing are similar. We're drawing from the same pool. And so if you're going for people, if you're working with people who are, 75 years old and have, these old pros, well, really what you're doing is you're reflecting how the business was in 1965.
Yeah.
So Seymour is who he is. He's from where he's from. I'm desperate to get material from Elaine May. I will do it. I will do it.
I don't know what shape she's in. I think she's in the not doing interviews mode. So that was one of my. I'd love to, but I'll never get her on my.
But this is
contributing something.
Yeah, but so this is the thing. What I'm trying to do. I'm always trying to demonstrate that type of culture, and there were Elaine May being a perfect example. The Efron sisters being another example. There were women who were doing it at the highest levels in 1972. So when somebody like that is available, I really do my best to work with them on what would make it easy for them, what would make them comfortable, all the rest, so that we can have that kind of diversity. But functionally, what usually happens is that I have the older cohort is shifted white and male because that's what it was like in 1975. They look at the National Lampoon, 9 out of every 10 editors were men. But I just talked to Sherry Flanagan on Friday.
I'm also dying to get on the show someday.
I'll work on her for you.
Yeah. I figured the MK Brown connection would
I'll
help.
work on her for you. Well, MK is another perfect example. So, so I'm always looking for diversity, particularly in the cohort that I'm a part of, age 49, and then also younger.
Yeah, that's the other question. How do you approach younger talent and balance that with the...
That is harder.
Yeah.
That is harder. One, because being paid is more important to them. And while we do pay everybody, it's simply a function of how many subscribers we have.
Sure.
We need 3,000 to be permanent, and we have about 700. So that gives you an idea. So I'm doing everything myself to save money. For free. I'm doing everything myself, which is fine. This is my, I said to somebody recently, I'm going to stop looking for my life's purpose. I think this is it, whether I like it or not. Yeah. Truly. And, I wish my life's purpose were running a television show and making $3 million a year, but that's not me. But anyway, so I am just always trying to get as much talent as I can get in. And I'm always trying to get as many interesting people as I can get in. And the thing about diversity, here's what I'll say, particularly in comedy. White men are at a disadvantage in comedy, which is an interesting thing to say, I suppose, because they're having to compete with all the white men that came before them. So it's pretty hard to actually say something new as a white man, and that's what makes diversity so important in comedy. It's time for all the voices that we haven't heard and all the perspectives we haven't heard to come out and be mainstream. Not for any kind of, like political correctness or social engineering. That's bullshit. Yeah. That's never what it's been about. That's been about, I'm a comedy fan and I want to hear something new. And so if a white guy has a new perspective or a great style, Jack Handy, if he came along now, he'd be great now. He's great then, whatever. Jack is Brian's age, I think 73, something like that. So that's really what I'm looking for. And what it's turning out is that more and more of the most interesting writers, the most interesting kind of things are female and diverse.
So those voices are...
So it's just, it's not, like I say, it's not a question of like, well, we gotta do this, we gotta do that. I'm trying to find the most interesting writers, and artists.
But it's just tough getting out of your cocoon. That's always been my...
Yeah, but here's what I'll say. Yeah. If you show willingness, like for example, I have a contributor named Nell Scoville, who is and Meryl Marco too. These are two women who've gone up in the comedy business. The dust is getting to me, in the 80s and 90s, so they were really on the front lines. And my wife works in television, and she's been on the front lines too. But Nell and Meryl, I'm always sort of asking them, hey, are you running across anybody who's particularly, that you think is bystander or, whatever, or needs a nudge or whatever? Because a lot of what bystander is about is, for the older people, it's a chance to practice this art that they love. For the middle people and younger people, well, younger people more, I'm trying always to nudge them a little quicker. For me, it took me 5 years to get to the right editor at The New Yorker. It took me 5 years to get the fax number for Saturday Night Live so I could write jokes. When we got to the right editor at The New Yorker, 2 of the 3 pieces got picked, and one of them is in the best of The New Yorker Fish Pajamas. So it was good stuff. It was good stuff when we were submitting it 5 years before, too. Mm-hmm. When I got to Saturday Night Live, my writing partner and I became the most prolific off-staff contributors in the history of the show, so we're told. But I lost 5 years of productivity. I lost 5 years of career because I didn't know the right people. And because I was an Ivy League kid who went to another school, I think that back in the day, the Harvard Lampoon Mafia, many people who are friends of mine now, I think there was a sort of reticence because they said, well, this guy's from Yale, he's good too, and if we let him into this plot, he's going to bring in all of his guys. That's a reasonable thing for them to think. Yeah. That's a reasonable concern for them to have. But what that does is that's how diversity gets kind of squeezed out in these sorts of fields that are completely subjective. So I think you have to work harder to always have the door open, to always be working with people. Like, I'm the kind of editor that I say, I don't get this. Can you explain this to me? What do you get? What am I trying to get at here? So I'm convincible. And I think that's another thing. These are all things that I've learned. The way that I edit Bystander is a direct consequence of my 10 years after school, 91 to 2002, literally in some periods not having enough money to eat. So I'm always thinking about that. I'm always thinking about how to put money into writers and artists' pockets. I'm always thinking about who needs a little nudge, and I'm happy to say that our younger writers often, lo and behold, 6 months later they've got a book contract, or 6 weeks later they've made it to Saturday Night Live or whatever. Did they always have the talent? Absolutely. But the people who are making these gatekeepers, and they are still as strong as they ever were. There was a time where the internet could get you around gatekeepers, but that's not happening anymore. The gatekeepers need signifiers. So if somebody gets hired and they don't work out, you can say, well, shit, he's a Harvard Lampoon guy. Of course I would have hired him. Or he's from The Onion, or he's from UCB or whatever. So does that answer your question about diversity? It's actually something I'm very passionate about because strangely,
it's very difficult, given that our projects are at least a little bit parallel to each other.
Yeah.
You could fall into a pattern and not realize that, oh shit, I just ran 12 pieces in a row by white guys.
You do this like I do this, I'm sure. So who else should I talk to? Oh, you should talk to,
Yeah. J.J. Settlemeyer gave me a giant
Who's
list
great,
after we got together. And then he told me the giant list he gave me was the same giant list he gave you early on, along with a couple of other non-humor people he added.
JJ is marvelous.
Yeah, he's good people.
Yeah,
and I keep a mind map of where every guest comes from. Which person connected me to which. You spring off
where'd
of
I come from?
You come off the Drew Friedman box.
Yeah, a lot of people from him, I'm sure.
And Drew, that led to the Brothers, that led to Bruce J, that led to a whole lot of other people.
Good.
But there's that cascade effect, certainly, that comes
people
from this.
Know who they know.
But who did you get who you didn't think you were going to get? Whose contribution surprised you, either from the very beginning or it took a few issues to get them to contribute something?
That's a hard one.
I mean, we joked about how difficult it is to get Ed Sorel to finish something.
Ed's an example of that. Still trying to get Henry Beard.
Yeah.
Going to get him. One of these years, I'm going to come up with something that he just can't resist. Because I admire his editing so much. It's hard. Nobody springs to mind because
I know there's people you're happy are in. Did you have targets?
I am such a supporter, a fan of these people, that I think they feel that. I think now they look at the magazine and go, oh, okay, this is good. This is a nice looking thing and my stuff will look good. And these people are, so you have that cascade effect. But also too, I think it's just so obvious that, that I am a fan. And so I think that puts people at their ease. And then my line with everybody is, what have you always wanted to do that you couldn't do? Or if you were hit by a bus tomorrow, what human piece or what piece of art would you really have wanted to do? And sometimes people are like, you're crazy, stop with that stuff. And then other people are like, okay, good, I got it. Because really what I'm offering is I get good people and I let them do what they want. And that's not how editors are trained now. That's how good editing is, but that's not how editors are trained. And I think it has to do with the Clay Felker kind of magazines as a zeitgeist heat thing. I think it's all bullshit.
Yeah.
I think that's all bullshit.
And Bettina Brown.
Yeah. I was in New York for all of that. And you look at that and you go, and I don't know Tina. And I'm glad that she revivified the New Yorker because it needed it. But I mean, zeitgeist is bullshit. It doesn't exist. It's a perceptual thing. It's publicity. We got enough of that. That's Trump, like when Trump won, everybody's scrambling to figure out how the zeitgeist changed. It could be that the zeitgeist has changed, or it could be that a fucking bunch of bots, switched some yeses to nos. We don't know, but that rush to sort of create a new mental map that the magazine or that cultural, entity then owns, That's what it's about. Well, we were the people who decided that this was the era of glam or whatever. It's like...
And instead you want the contributors to make something.
Yeah, well, just as I'm saying this, I go, okay, Warhol's Interview. Warhol's Interview is a great magazine within the context of all the other magazines that were out in 1973. If all you have is Son of Warhol's Interview, or on the web, if all you have is Spy, if all you have is snarky, gawker, da-da-da, I love it as much as everybody else does, but there's a kind of poverty to that.
Yeah. Moderation. Snark is nice in small doses, but when it becomes a dominant mode of communication, you end up with...
It's also, this is the thing, I don't want to get off on this, but irony is a very high-level processing skill. And so, I have a lot of, I had a writer make it, like comedy writers love jokes about Hitler and Jews. And, as we know, maybe those jokes aren't landing in the way that we think they are, right? So
I'm still trying to craft why I went to the opening matinee of Inglourious Bastards as opposed to waiting for that night just so I could see Nazis get scalped a few hours early. But between us that works. Normal crowd, not gonna fly.
Yeah, and so in any case, there were some other questions you wanted to ask before.
Oh, they're going to be pretty wide-ranging ones on the nature of Funny Bones. Oh no, we don't have time for this one because I have to go drive out to Moby after this.
Oh, okay.
But we're going to talk about Funny Bones.
Boy, that is so LA. I'm sorry, dude. I can't talk to you anymore. I'm talking to Moby.
I have to talk to Moby. Yeah. It's
well,
just
ask me a short one then.
How funny are your contributors in person? How much time do you spend around funny people?
That varies so incredibly wildly. All of them are distinctively themselves. All of them are just sort of wry. Somebody like Sam Gross will make you laugh regularly.
Oh, God, yeah.
P.S. Mueller will make me laugh. All of them make me laugh, but it's,
But some
I'm constantly
some people are funny when they're sitting by themselves writing jokes as opposed to.
And also, I'm constantly running the supercomputer here. It's like, okay, I can get this from Sam, and where am I going to put that? I'm going to put that on page 3. Okay, how's that going to work? How big is it going to be? Okay, what do I need? The only way that I can do these 100-page issues processing, somebody said it's like 400 pieces, it is to constantly churning it. Yeah. Is to think about, okay, MK, you're going to give me a spread this time instead of one page. All right, I'll move you to the features, and who am I going to get for your 1-page place, and all that sort of thing. Yeah,
but sitting around with these guys in person, though, when you're hanging out, do they tend to be, do they have funny bones? Yeah,
of course. They're all primarily nice, and I actually do that on purpose. I really try to cultivate. I don't like the frenemy thing that you have with comedy things, like Lampoon was full of frenemies, and Spy, I don't know, but I would guess was full of clashing. We don't have enough money or time, and I don't have any interest. So I really do tend to skew towards people like Drew, who are wonderful.
Yeah. And who legitimately just want to connect more people who are going to enjoy each other's company.
And I have found that the most talented people are invariably the nicest. The people that are prickly or whatever, it's because they're insecure and all the rest of that stuff. And so what I try to do, because I've been there myself, I'm frequently when I'm talking to these people like, Bob Blackman or whatever, Seymour Quast, these people like amazing. So I get it. I get it when you feel uncomfortable. And so I think what I'm trying to do always with bystander people is make them feel welcome and make them feel like this is some place where they really belong. That seems to be happening, and I'm very proud of that. I ask them about their personal lives. I ask them about their health. I tell them about the things that I'm interested and passionate about. Really, with humor magazines, and I learned this at the Yale Record, that there's no reason for them, but they are wonderful engines of friendship. And that's what I'm interested in my life. I want to have a lot of friends. I want to have a lot of people who I care about, who care about me. And though Bystander is financially ruinous, it is wonderful to know all these people and work with them. It's wonderful to have spent the morning talking to you about this. I just feel very fortunate. So it's a great experience. I just hope that we can. And in fact, I know we will. I know we will get to that 3,000, and we'll get to 5,000, and 10,000, and 25,000, and at that point, we'll really be able to pay these people not what they're worth, but something that isn't just wildly insulting. And that's really important to me. I want everybody to know how much I respect them, how much I care about their material and them as people. And I think that comes through. And that's what makes me continue to do it in the face of all that.
The promise of a diamond house and a solid gold rocket car.
Oh, yes, of course. Yeah, yes, of course.
I will let you get back to the financially ruinous cocktail party.
That's exactly what it is.
But we're going to continue this in New York next time you're out, because I want to talk about your theories, not theories of comedy, because that's the worst goddamn thing in the world to call it. But we'll talk about that next time. I have them.
Yeah.
Thanks so much for coming on.
My pleasure, Gil. I hope it was helpful and interesting and funny.
And that was Michael Gerber. If you're a regular listener of this show, you need to start subscribing to the American Bystander. The best way to do that is via Patreon at patreon.com/bystander. You can also hit Kickstarter and search for American Bystander to see if the upcoming issue is taking donations, but that's a more complicated way to get a single issue. I hope we conveyed the importance of this magazine and the quality of it over the course of our conversation. If we haven't, that's on me. The American Bystander is a wonderful project. I'm so happy it exists. I'm happy Michael is out there making it. I'm happy all of these artists and writers are contributing to it on a regular basis. I want it to be a success. I want a print analog of what I do regularly. Now, As far as Trump's KGB file goes, here's what Michael wrote me this weekend. The KGB file is a go. We are doing it as a special section inside the issue. First time we've ever done that, a bit like how Lampoon's yearbook parody began life as a Kenny O'Donohue article in 1970. Then, if people like the idea, if we raise enough for the issue number 9 Kickstarter, we'll expand the KGB file to a full-length book in 2019. I've got plenty of people champing at the bit to do it. It's just a question of money. And besides that, I asked Michael what else is going on for the Bystander that I should tell our listeners about, and he said, we're ramping up to do a holiday special podcast, taping in November and dropping in December, and then we're planning a live sketch show in LA in February and March. We also talked about running excerpts of some of my podcasts in the Bystander in future. I'll work with some of our guests to make sure we have permission to do that. Meanwhile, visit AmericanBystander.org to learn a little bit more about the mag. Follow Bystander tweets on Twitter, although like we talked about, the Bystander really isn't about online jokesterism. And most importantly, go to patreon.com/bystander and support this magazine, because it's really something worth supporting in this day and age. And after we wrapped, I asked Michael, so, who are you reading? And if you want to hear his answer to that, you'll need to become a supporter of the Virtual Memories Show so you can get access to our quarterly bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet. I promise I'll get the third quarter episode up soon. I spent the weekend kind of running around, just exhausting myself doing a bunch of errands and other stuff. And it was more important to me to get this episode ready than it was to get that quarterly bonus one ready, which is letting down my patrons, blah, blah, blah. I promise I will take care of it really, really soon. That said, the most recent episode does feature book recommendations from the second quarter's Virtual Memories Show guests, and that's a pretty awesome lineup. Stephen Heller, Dean Haspiel, Jaime Hernandez, J.J. Settlemeyer, Michael Kupperman, Ilana Meyer, Christopher Brown, Irvin Ungar, Alberto Manguel, Chris Reynolds, and Dave Calver. Now, you can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, blah, 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 and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Now, I recorded this episode at the Public Library in Santa Monica. It was part of my 30-hour visit to L.A. prior to a conference in San Diego, so my company paid for my airfare and my parking back in New Jersey, but I paid for my hotel in L.A. and my rental car for that part of the trip. All told, it was around $400 in total. I did get 3 podcasts out of the visit, Glenn David Gold, Moby, and this one, so it works out. Still, if you want to help defray some of the costs of the Virtual Memories Show, like web hosting, travel, equipment, coffee, or if you just want to toss me some money because you think the show is worth it, then visit patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod and make a one-time or recurring donation. A special thanks go out to Joe Caruso, Michael Hacker, Michael Janizik, Paul Karasik, Fred Kish, Jonathan Kranz, Jack Les Camella, Teresa Lewis, Stephen Nadler, Payne Prophet, Dmitry Samarov, Stephen Solomon, Craig P. Steffen, Greg Tanner, Ford Thomas, Noah Van Skyver, and Garrett Zecker for going over and above in their support of the Virtual Memories Show. We have the full list of show supporters at chimeraobscura.com/VM. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, one of my favorite recent guests, and used with permission from the artist. You can find him on SoundCloud at Mayforth, and the fourth is a 4th. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with Mark Derry, author of the upcoming bio of Edward Gorey, Born to be Posthumous. And you can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSPod, at Facebook.com/Virtual Memories Show, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. That'll help us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and you are awesome. Keep it that way.